Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the urinary system, and I have to say the urinary system is probably my most favorite system because there's just so much that it is responsible for, and it's really important in homeostasis of many different body mechanisms. And even though the urinary system is really quite simple, there's not that many components to it, it has so many different functions. So let's talk about that. So the primary thing that the urinary system is going to do is it's going to filter the blood. And that's what most people think about, is the fact that we take blood and we're going to filter out waste product and we're going to excrete it. And this could be metabolic waste, which are wastes that are produced just by sort of normal functioning of the cells, as well as foreign substances like dyes or drugs or things like that. The urinary system is also going to regulate your total body water. What that means is basically the urinary system is in charge of trying to retain water when you start to get dehydrated or excreting extra water when you're well hydrated and you just don't need it. It's also going to regulate ion concentrations. Things like sodium and potassium ions can be either excreted or held in by the urinary system. And then one big thing that it does is it's going to regulate your acid-base balance. Remember, that is the pH. So the pH of your blood can be affected by how much hydrogen ions get excreted by the urinary system. Now, that is what most people sort of think of when they think of the urinary system, but there's a couple other functions that we're going to do. So for example, we're going to regulate our blood pressure using the urinary system. If blood pressure is sensed to be too low, the kidney will release an enzyme called renin. And renin is the first step in activating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, which we learned about in the endocrine system. The urinary system also is important in regulating the oxygen levels in our blood. When those oxygen levels get too low, the kidney is going to sense it and is going to produce a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. And you might have heard some people do something called EPO doping because EPO triggers the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. More red blood cells means you can carry more oxygen in your blood. The last thing I want to talk about today is the fact that the kidney is really important in converting vitamin D to its active form. So we all know that we need vitamin D for strong bones and muscles, and you might even know that you can go outside and get some sunlight on your face, on your skin, and that is going to convert molecules in your skin into a precursor for vitamin D. But those precursors all come to the kidney to be converted into its active form. So the urinary system is really important in maintaining strong bones as well. So the urinary system is composed of two kidneys, 1, 2, and they look like little kidney beans. They're about the size of like half of your fist. They're not that big. On top of the kidneys are two adrenal glands. They're like little hats that sit on top of the kidneys. And we learned already about all of the important things that the adrenal glands do in the endocrine system. There are also two ureters, and these are these tubes right here. There's one right there, and there's one right there. And that is a muscular tube that carries urine from the kidney down into the urinary bladder. So the urinary bladder is right here. And the urinary bladder is really just a storage tank to store urine until it is a convenient time to release it. The tube that leads from the urinary bladder out of the body is called the urethra, and that passes the urine outside of the body when we're excreting it. So the kidneys form the urine, and then the rest of this is all just tubing to take the urine out of the body. There are two sphincters. The internal sphincter is at the very beginning of the bladder here, and the external sphincter is at the opening to the outside of the body. The external sphincter is skeletal muscle, so it's voluntary. This is what you hold on to when you don't want to pee, and what you release when you're ready to urinate. The internal sphincter is up here, and it is made out of smooth muscle. So this is involuntary. Your autonomic nervous system controls this. This is not voluntary. Now remember that the urinary bladder is lined with transitional epithelium. This type of epithelium can stretch out as the urinary bladder expands. Normally, when the bladder is empty, it's very small, but as it fills up with urine, it's going to expand. As it expands, the stretch receptors in the walls of the urinary bladder are going to send a signal up to the brain. The brain is the control center and is going to make a decision about whether this is a good time to urinate or whether we need to hold on to it for a little bit longer. There are muscles in the walls of the urinary bladder. The muscle is called the detrusor muscle. And when it is time to release the urine, the brain will send impulses to the detrusor muscle to contract and squeeze the urine out through the urethra. Now, in men and women, the urethra is different length. So in women, the urethra is quite short. It's only about 4 centimeters, whereas in men, the urethra has to go all the way through the length of the penis and is about 20 centimeters long. And one of the consequences for this is that women are much more likely to suffer from urinary tract infections. A urinary tract infection can be an infection of the urethra, the bladder, the ureter, and even the kidney. So they can get progressively worse as they go up the system. And the reason that women are more susceptible to it is not only is the urethra shorter, so any bacteria that gets into it has a shorter distance to go before possibly being washed out by urine. The external urethra orifice, the outside orifice, is very close to the vagina and the rectum. And so there's a lot more bacteria and yeast in that area than in the man. In the male system, the urethra goes through the penis and opens at the head of the penis. And since this is not near the anus in the man, there's not as much contamination possible. Looking at the internal anatomy of the kidney, we have the renal cortex, which is the outer part, and the medulla, which is the inner part. And we've seen these terms before when we talked about the adrenal glands. They had a cortex and medulla as well. Because one of the functions of the kidney is to filter the blood, it needs to have an excellent blood supply. So blood comes into the kidney on the renal artery, and it leaves the kidney on the renal vein. We've already talked about the ureter. That's just that tube that leads from the kidney to the urinary bladder. If we look a little closer at what's going on in the renal cortex, we can actually see that the nephron, which is this sort of spaghetti-looking pile of tubes here, is the functional unit of the kidney. So this is the part that is going to be doing the filtration. The nephron is partly in the cortex and partly in the medulla, and you can kind of see the line between the cortex and the medulla right here. So when we talk about the functions of the kidney, we have to keep in mind that there's this great blood supply coming in, and then there's also the actual kidney. So this is made up of 2 systems. One of them is the blood. The other one is the kidney, more specifically the nephron, because the nephron is the functional part of the kidney. Now this looks really messy. It's very hard to see what's going on. So I prefer to take away the blood supply so we can just look at the nephron. So I have a picture of that right here. Here you can see the nephron alone. This is the functional part of the kidney. And what that means is that the nephron does many of the processes that help the kidney have so many functions. And it starts here in the nephron capsule. The nephron capsule is the first part of the nephron, and it receives the filtrate from the glomerulus, which is the blood supply. So again, this is kind of like 2 systems shaking hand. The blood supply and the nephron capsule come together almost in like a mitt and a ball. And the ball is the glomerulus and the mitt is the nephron capsule. Immediately after the nephron capsule, any fluid, any materials that come into the nephron are going to move into the proximal convoluted tubule. You might also see this written as the PCT, and it's called the proximal convoluted tubule because it's closest to the nephron capsule, to the beginning, the start of the nephron. And remember, proximal means closer. If we continue through the nephron, we're going to go through this PCT and down into a long descending loop. And this descending loop dips down into the medulla. The rest of the nephron is up in the cortex. We're then going to come back up out of the medulla on the ascending loop. Sometimes these will be called descending limb and ascending limb. Just depends on what textbook you're looking at. Then whatever materials are still in this tube are going to move through the distal convoluted tubule. And again, it's called distal because it's much further away from the point of the beginning of the nephron. The fluid that's in the tube is going to go into the collecting duct. And the collecting duct receives fluid from many different nephrons. So you might have hundreds or thousands of nephrons that are emptying their filtrate into this one tube. These structures are the parts of the nephron that are important in performing the three processes necessary for filtering and clearing the blood and forming urine. Those processes are the subject of the next video, nephron physiology. But I have to include one more structure. This structure is very important in the homeostasis of blood pressure. In the wall of the distal convoluted tubule is an area that's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And it's kind of snuggled up in here in between the afferent arteriole, which brings blood into the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole, which takes blood out of the glomerulus. We talked about the juxtaglomerular apparatus previously, way back in the endocrine system, when we talked about the RAS system, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And what happens is that the juxtaglomerular apparatus is important in the homeostasis of blood pressure. When blood pressure falls, the juxtaglomerular apparatus is looking at the pressure in the efferent and afferent arterioles. And when it senses that change, when there is a change in the pressure of those vessels, which is picked up by a mechanoreceptor, the juxtaglomerular apparatus is going to produce something called renin. Now, if you remember, renin is an enzyme, and it is going to act on a particular chemical that's already in the blood called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is going to be converted into angiotensin 1 by renin. Angiotensin 1 is going to continue in the bloodstream through the body, and when it reaches the lungs, it's going to be worked on by another enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. And that angiotensin converting enzyme is going to transform angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to have a couple of effects. The first one is it's going to cause vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. So as the blood vessels constrict, that's going to lower the volume in the vessels, which will increase the blood pressure. So we're going to come back up here, and we're going to raise the blood pressure back up again. Negative feedback. The other thing that angiotensin is going to do is it's going to act on the adrenal glands. We've also talked about the adrenal glands. And those glands are going to produce something called aldosterone, which is a hormone that acts on the distal convoluted tubule. So what it does is it causes the distal convoluted tubule to increase sodium retention. So it's going to actively transport sodium out of the tube and back into the bloodstream. And now because we have moved sodium, water is going to follow. And water will follow because of osmosis. Because there's more stuff, sodium, out here, water will follow it. So if we increase water retention, we're going to increase blood volume, which will increase blood pressure. So all of this stuff is a homeostatic feedback loop, starting with the juxtaglomerular apparatus right here, monitoring that blood pressure of the efferent and afferent arterioles. The next video is going to be talking about the 3 processes that we use to create urine and filter the blood. That's it for today. See you in class.